Hi there. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Jackie Kerr. I'm a fellow at the Kennedy School Belfer Center's Cyber Project this year. We've talked a little bit about a couple of threats to the future of the global internet already. We've talked about cybersecurity and cyber warfare, and we've talked about cyber crime and cyber terrorism. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about another threat, which is as states exert greater and greater control over the internet within their territory, what that potential threat that has for the development and future of the global internet and potential for fragmentation. We see here an image from a major protest movement in Russia in 2011-2012, which was known to highly leverage the internet and information technologies. Largest protest movement that had occurred in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. At the time, the internet in Russia was still highly unrestricted relative to the overall regime type, and which made it a very interesting case of asymmetry in terms of the online versus offline regime type. There was a period for a long time in the 90s and 2000s where so-called web idealists thought of the internet as a liberation technology which would continuously strengthen the hand of society vis-a-vis nation states, and which was generally unregulatable by states. However, in the early days of the internet, people like John Gilmer from the EFF would describe the internet as routing around censorship, as being fundamentally unregulatable. But we've seen a sea change in this in recent years. Researchers from University of Toronto's Citizen Lab now describe it as where it was once considered impossible for governments to control cyberspace, there are now a wide variety of technical and non-technical means at their disposal to shape and limit the online flow of information. The technology is changing and evolving, and states are becoming more aware of how they can, in one way or another, restrict or dampen the uses by society of the internet within their territory. And so I'll talk with you a little bit about the global trends we see in the wide variety of different methods that states are using to try to control the use of the internet within their societies. I'll give you one very interesting dynamic example, the Russian case in the last few years where policies have been changing dramatically, and a little bit about what the future prospects are and how this discussion of norms and ethics might play into that. When we think of internet regulation in non-democratic settings in particular, we often think of things like this. This is from Qatar. I saw this guy a few times when I was living there a couple of years ago. It's at least humorous, but a block page telling you this information is banned for one reason or another. But internet restrictions have moved well beyond just this kind of blunt blocking. There's now a wide variety of different approaches, sometimes referred to as generations, with the first generation being the blunter instruments, the things that are more obvious, like site blocking we just saw, like keyword filtering, manual content censorship of particular types of content. These are all things, for example, we see in the Chinese so-called Great Firewall, complete network shutdowns like you saw in Egypt during the Arab Spring. On the other hand, there are things which are subtler, more plausibly deniable, more legalistic, which have been adopted in recent years, sometimes layered on top of these blunter types of techniques, and sometimes in the absence of those. Russia was for a long time seen as a pioneer in some of these second-generation approaches, even though the internet was generally uncensored. Approaches like legal measures, like takedown requests behind the scenes to service providers or to hosting providers to particular sites, DDoS attacks on election day on some particular resource, use of patriotic trolling or patriotic hacking groups that have some link that's sort of plausibly deniable to the government. So there are a lot of different approaches being taken. There's also a wide variety across states that are of otherwise similar regime type, a wide variety of different levels of restriction. This is data from 2011 from the Open Net Initiative project at Citizen Lab, looking at internet censorship levels versus offline civil liberties restrictions, or overall regime type in terms of civil liberties restrictions. And what you see is, instead of being a perfect correlation, a lot of data falls in this lower right corner, where you have states which have lots of restrictions on civil society, on the media, on freedom of expression overall or offline, but they don't have much by way of internet censorship. So this is sometimes referred to as policy asymmetry, a lack of policy linkage between the online and offline space. Russia, for example, falls into that category. You see down there. And a lot of states of the former Soviet region, actually. You also see some regional dynamics. The color coding is by region. You see some clusters, like up in the right-hand corner, the black is the states of the Gulf Commonwealth, the GCC, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, which were more exemplars in the other direction of having high censorship. Another interesting pattern you see is that as penetration increases, while you might expect one sort of monotonic increase in restriction as the internet plays a more important role in society, becomes more politicized. And in fact, you probably do see more regulation even in democracies. In terms of censorship data, what you see is that most authoritarian states seem to follow a trend towards greater censorship as internet penetration rates increase, whereas the most democratic states seem to coalesce around a less high censorship model. But then, so this is coded from Freedom House's Freedom in the World, partly free, not free, and most free states. It's a not ideal heuristic, but if you look at the states that are in black, that are partly free, these are states which some political scientists would refer to as electoral authoritarian states, hybrid regimes, and they face some real conflicting pressures. At this point, they're all over the place. They haven't followed either of these trends yet, and it's unclear which they will. Internet penetration in these states also tends to be still, at that point in time, relatively low. Makes it interesting to look at a case like Russia, which certainly has, through the 2000s, been this kind of state that has characteristics of both democracy and of an authoritarian state. So looking at the Russian case, you see an example where there's been a policy sea change in recent years, where the internet was largely uncensored. It was seen as something of a free-for-all, in spite of a crackdown on media, on civil society throughout the 2000s. And since this protest movement, which really drew attention to the risks the regime faced, you have a real dramatic change with crackdown on the internet in terms of new legal restrictions, so much so that activists have come to call the Duma, the Russian legislature, the crazy printer, because new laws since 2012 are being adopted for different types of content after content after content. You also have a crackdown on the ICT sector. Pavel Durov, the former head of VKontakte, Russia's Facebook, fleeing the country a year ago, saying that he'd been forced to sell his shares because he wouldn't take down sites related to the conflict in Ukraine. And it crackdown on independent media, especially online media, which had once been seen, the internet had once been seen in Russia as the last place for free media. And this increasing rhetoric of information warfare, of information security, especially relating to the conflict in Ukraine. So what does this say? What do developments like this in an important exemplar case like Russia, or these global trends we see, say about the future prospects for an interconnected internet, which continues to be a global network of networks, a global common good? A few things to wrap up. First, we've seen that there are these diverging policy trends. And it's unclear whether those will continue in the same way. These things keep changing. Events like the Arab Spring, events like the Snowden revelations have a systematic exogenous shock effect on the policy choices of states. But it's at least troubling to see this kind of patchwork quilt effect of states pulling away and taking more very different approaches, maybe in many cases moving towards developing their internet almost like a national intranet in more and more sophisticated ways. So there's this threat of fragmentation. At the same time, you have the technology changing and countries becoming more technologically sophisticated about what sorts of approaches they can take. You have real cases of authoritarian learning within regions and across states of similar regime type. States learning from observing the policies being adopted by other states and the technologies. There's an issue of availability. States seeing a technological approach they hadn't known before and using it and applying it at home. What can be done about this? What other things might be intervening factors that could affect this future? It seems that this discussion of norms that we're starting here today is very important. And it will continue to play an important role because many of the states which haven't yet taken as severe an approach towards internet restriction are also states which will face dueling pressures. Pressures to develop their economy. Many of them are developing countries. Many of them are countries which, at least in name, base their legitimacy on being democratic, having democratic institutions. This makes them vulnerable to economic performance legitimacy if they go too hard against their ICT sector. It also makes them vulnerable to these sorts of protest movements that leverage the technologies. But they also are very keenly aware of the risks of not abiding by international norms in ways that would badly affect their reputation at home and abroad. And that's why this discussion of norms is so important. Thanks so much.